Okay, good afternoon. My name is Cristina. I come from Spain, and it is a pleasure for me to have the chance to participate in the Korean TESOL International Conference this year. I'm currently a language primary teacher at a state school, and I'm doing research on the impact of storytelling and vocabulary development and intercultural awareness. Needless to value the contribution of my co-presenter, Josebella Medina, who has taken part in the elaboration of this investigation project. So the title of my presentation, as you can see here in the first slide, is Vocabulary Development and Intercultural Awareness through Digital Storytelling in Primary Education. I hope you liked it. And we're gonna start with an introduction about the importance and the effect of digital storytelling in education. As it is essential to recognize the importance of DST in education as a meaningful technology integrated approach for engaged student learning, the expression of identity by students using the multimodal resources available in digital story, and the creation of constructive learning environments with digital storytelling. Moreover, digital storytelling contributes to cultural inclusion using stories focused on children with special education needs or disadvantaged groups like immigrants and refugees, which serves as teacher training on empathy towards this group of learners. As for the impact of DST on English foreign language, it is an innovative tool with a motivating factor, that is the exposure of students to digital media, the development of autonomous learners, and its great impact on oral and written skills. Taking these theoretical notions into consideration, we need to ask ourselves three important questions as the main objectives of this research. The first question is, can digital storytelling be used to develop vocabulary knowledge among primary education students? Second question is, can DST be used to increase intercultural awareness? And question number three is, what is the impact of using DST versus printed books and EFL vocabulary learning in primary education students? Of course, for this research to be developed, some instruments are required, like a pre-post test based on a questionnaire and some cocktails from different cultural backgrounds. In this case, Vietnam, Europe, and the Middle East. As for this in-class experiment, the students group, based on convenience sampling, consisted of 128 students aged 7 to 9 years old, who belong to the public state school Balcó de Finestrat in Alicante, and who come from 24 different cultural backgrounds, with new upcoming students coming to school all around the year. There are three main different groups based on course level. Each level was in turn divided into one control group, that is, those students exposed to the printed version of the tale, and one experimental group, as for those students exposed to the digital media. This experiment was developed for a 3-month period when students were exposed to a pre-post test based on the 3 folktales mentioned before, depending on the age level. About the 3 folktales, we can see here the first one, How Tiger Got His Stripes, a folktale from a Vietnamese origin for 2nd graders, the youngest students of the experiment. Then we have the 3rd graders with the Magic Apples, folktale from the Middle East. And the oldest students, the 4th grade students, with a stone soup folktale coming from European origins. In the next slide, you have here the link to the videos if you wish to have a look sometime. Okay, as previously stated, this in-class research was focused on a sample of 128 primary students who were exposed to a 40-question pretest divided in turn into 3 different sections. The first 14 questions were devoted to social demographic data, that is the students' cultural background, traveling habits, reading habits, their exposure to the digital media, to linguistic immersion and affinity to the language. While the second section was dealing with those questions related to language skills and vocabulary development. The last section, third and last section, focused on intercultural awareness using an intercultural sensitivity scale. As for the post-test, it was composed of 16 questions, and this section was replicating the pretest, the language skills section of the pretest, after the students' exposure to the printed version for the control group or the digital version for the experimental group. And now we come with the, some of the results of this experiment in the different groups. Here we have one of the groups, okay, taking into account the second grade as the youngest group. Some of the results of the social demographic data here, we can observe in both groups the difference between the control group and the experimental group in the percentage of Russian and Spanish speakers in both groups. As it is a school decision to split the groups as new students come all around the year. That's why there are more Russian speakers in one group rather than the other. This could influence, okay, the language affinity and their exposure to the language at home. This slide is related to the next slide, where traveling habits in the group A, the control group, are more frequent than in the experimental group, which could also influence the exposure of those students to the language and in turn, their vocabulary development and acquisition. As for the reading habits, there is also a greater exposure of students to reading habits in the control group rather than the experimental group. Hence, although both groups show a clear interest in digital media, control group second graders are really more exposed to technology devices than the experimental group. Okay, this could, of course, affect the results in the different kinds of questions proposed in the language section, which mainly deal with picture-word correspondence questions, multiple choice questions, and sentence completion questions. Here, in the next 3 slides, we can observe some of the different kinds of activities offered. This is one of the questions where I chose a sentence. They listen to a sentence and they have to circle or to match the correct photograph with a corresponding sentence. Then this is the picture and word correspondence questions. They have a photograph of some of the vocabulary items in the story and they have to produce language. They have to answer to this question. And finally, this is the multiple choice or sentence completion questions where they have to choose the correct option after being exposed to the, and after, of course, in the post-test being exposed to the tale, either in the printed or digital version. Despite differences in the exposure to the language, this grid shows quite similar results in percentages of students' guesses in the post-test. While there exists a great improvement in the results between the pre and the post-test in the experimental group, leading maybe to the conclusion that digital media has a great and a positive impact on vocabulary acquisition and production. As for the older groups, if I'm taking into consideration the group on the third graders students with the magic apple folktale from the Middle East. And here we can observe in the bar charts that there is a little percentage of English speakers in the experimental group, which maybe could influence the results I will show in the next slide. As for the reading habits, however, they do not have an impact on later results, despite the greater percentage of the control group reading exposure versus the experimental group. Regarding their exposure to the digital media, however, both groups are highly exposed to digital media on a daily basis through different kind of access like phones, tablets, and PCs. And here we have some of the kind of questions similar to those offered to second grade students. This is the kind of questions where they have to listen to a sentence and mark the corresponding answered. And as we can see in the experimental group post-test, some of the guesses were better, they have better results in the experimental group rather than in the control group. Here we have the kind of questions speak to word correspondence, where 20 out of 100 students in the control group are opposed to the 36 out of 100 in the experimental group. So once more, experimental group was more successful in this case. And finally, we've got the 3 multiple choice sentence completion, where the experimental group in this case guessed the percentage was higher, so they guessed more students guessed the answer than in the control group exposed to the traditional printed tale. Surprisingly, as for the results in the language section, we can observe that the results are quite similar for the post-test, what leads to the conclusion that maybe some other variables need to be taken into account rather than just their exposure to the digital or the traditional printed tale. Then here we have the third part of the test based on an intercultural scale, which focus on measuring student sensitivity towards other cultures. So based on a 3-color code, learners answer 10 questions related to the willingness to meet other students from different cultural backgrounds and language. And as we can see, the results show quite similar responses. What makes us think of the digital media does not really influence the perception towards other cultural groups, but rather the cultural background and language affinity. Here we have in the next slide some of the questions offered to students to measure the intercultural sensitivity towards other students coming to school. Like this one, the first one, me gusta hablar con compañeros de diferentes culturas. They show similar results as you can see in the slide. O pienso que mi cultura es mejor que otras. We show better results in the experimental group, but sometimes it does not depend, of course, on the digital or printed media of the folktale exposure, rather on other variables such as language affinity and values at home and cultural background, as I previously stated. So what can we conclude? Okay, bearing in mind the three main objectives of this research, that is the impact of digital storytelling for vocabulary knowledge among primary education students, we can just state that DST is beneficial at the students' vocabulary productive performance. Although some differences were observed in the control group and the experimental group, these differences are based on the cultural background and how exposure to digital media, reading habits, and language affinity. As for the second objective, that is the impact of DST to increase intercultural, the contribution to increase intercultural awareness, we can conclude that intercultural sensitivity is not affected by the selection of stories, but by the students' cultural differences and affinity to the language. As for the last objective, that is the impact of using DST versus printed books on EFL vocabulary learning among primary education students, the conclusion leads to the fact that digital media does have a positive influence on the students' motivation towards EFL learning, as a great exposure to the digital media is done rather than traditional storytelling. Here you have the references I've used for my presentation and my experiment and my project. And thank you very much for this opportunity to take part in the conference. And if you have any questions, do not have to contact me via my email or any other kind of contact. Thank you very much for everything, and I hope to see you next year.